Hello, Miss Scribble here. Today I'm going to show you 4 different watercolor techniques. And we're going to use those watercolor techniques to create 4 different style pine trees. A wet on dry, a wet on wet, masking technique, and wax resist. So let's get started. The watercolors that I am using for this tutorial are Reeves watercolor set. It looks like the box looks like this. It might change because I had this forever and I'm finally kind of using them again. So you can use this or Crayola watercolors work fine, or any kind of watercolor paint you have will do the job. So what I did is I just put a little bit in this just plastic paint palette and just with a little water. So I just go around after I put the paint in there, just putting drops and drops of water in there just to keep my paint activated. And the paints I have are sap green. This one is called Verdarian hue, I guess. And then this one is bright red, and this is burnt umber. But as long as you have light green and a dark green and a red and brown, you're good to go. So I'm going to show you 4 different ways, and the first way is a wet on dry technique for our Christmas tree. And actually we're going to need a pencil. You don't have to use a pencil for this part, but I like it because it gives me some kind of guide to know where to paint. So since you're making a pine tree, I'm just drawing a very light triangle on my paper, and I'm drawing it on watercolor paper. But you can also use very heavy cardstock or sketchbook paper even might work if you don't have watercolor paper. So I got my little triangle, and we're going to do a wet on dry technique, which means the paper's dry and my paint is wet. So all we're going to do is I'm just dipping my brush in some water and getting a little paint on my brush, and we're just going to do vertical lines in a row into the shape of this triangle. And it's okay if the vertical lines touch each other or touch the other row above. You can dip into the dark green if you want to add a variety of different colors. You can switch between dark green and the light green. Notice I'm only staying inside the triangle until I get to the very bottom. Then I'm going to rinse my brush, and I'm going to get into the burnt umber here, or your brown paint, whatever you got. And I'm just going to add a little trunk, which is just a little square, and fill it in. And it's okay if the paint pours into that. I like it because it gives it more of an expressive look. And that's the first technique. Okay, so I put the other pine tree off to the side to let it dry, and I'm going to show you now the next technique, which is using a wet on wet technique. So we're going to take our pencil and we're going to draw another triangle nice and light on your paper. For this one you might want to draw your triangle if you're choosing not to. For this one you might want to because of the technique we're going to use. And by the way, I'm just using a rounded paintbrush. I should have mentioned that for the first part, and I apologize. But you can use a square paintbrush if you want to, with a square top. It's up to you. So for wet on wet, what that means is we're going to take our paintbrush and we're going to dip it in some water, and we're just going to add a thin layer of water within the triangle. We don't want it to be a pool of water. We just want it to be wet enough so the paint can be pulled in any direction. You can always add more if you notice it's not doing the technique. So we're going to use both greens for this one also. It's up to you which one you want to use, but we're definitely going to use a combination of both. So when you take your paintbrush, you're going to dip in the paint, and then when you touch, you see how it pulls in all the directions where we put the water, but it's staying in our triangle shape. Because we didn't add any water outside the triangle, it stays inside your triangle. And if you want to add using the dark green, it's going to start blending together. And I love that effect. This is my favorite watercolor technique, which is wet on wet. So if you notice that it's not really pulling at the bottom here, it's because I may not have enough water there. So if you notice that happening, just rinse off your brush and then just add just a little bit of water so that it starts to pull. And then you can go back and just continue on. This is good if you're creating a row of pine trees and you want to create like a forest. This technique is really nice for this one. Okay, so I added our layer of our pine tree. I made it all the way to the bottom here, and I'm just going to use the brown or the burnt umber to add a trunk, And again, it's just going to pull right into it, but I like it that way. If you don't like it that way, you can wait for it to dry and then add the trunk later. I'm going to show you another technique along with the wet on wet technique, which is using salt. And we just have Old Reliable Morton salt. And I'm just going to pour just a little bit in my hand, and we're just going to sprinkle that right on top. And I feel like this gives it kind of like a snowy kind of look. If you don't like to wait for your paint to dry, you can just use a hair dryer to let it dry. Alright, so I used the hair dryer to let it dry, but you can wait for it to dry, it's up to you. And I'm just going back to kind of scrape off the salt. It's going to give it kind of that speckly, kind of salty look. So we're using salt, right? But I think it kind of gives it that snow look. So if you look closely, it has kind of split apart the paint, and that's what gives it that salt. That's what the salt does for it. It splits apart the paint a little bit. And that's the salt with wet on wet technique. So the next technique I'm going to show you is the masking method. So I just have a roll of masking tape here. If you have artist's tape, you can use that, or even Scotch tape works. And we're going to use it to mask off or block the paper to create a triangle shape for our pine tree. So I'm just going to take off a piece of masking tape carefully, probably about that big, and we're going to tear it off. And what I like to do, instead of just putting it directly on the paper, is I take it and I just put it on my clothes, like on my pants, and then just tear it off a couple times. And the reason being is you don't want it to be too sticky, because you can risk tearing your paper. So if you want to draw a triangle first, it's up to you. I'm just going to go for it. So we're going to put down our tape on a diagonal. And again, don't really press on the paper, because we are going to take this off. And we don't want our paper to rip. So I'm going to take another piece for the other side of our pine tree. And then I'm going to put it right diagonally on the other side. And then for the bottom, we want to add a little trunk. So I'm just going to do like a small piece on each side. Now this is kind of jagged, but it's up to you if you want to use scissors to cut your masking tape. You might get a cleaner edge. Now we're going to paint inside our masked pine tree using our our light green and our dark green colors. So I'm going to just paint inside. You can also use the wet on wet technique with this, or you can do this method with just the vertical lines. This one really offers you to do any kind of those techniques I showed you so far, because we're just masking out the outside, and you'll see what happens when I remove the tape. So we're going to let that dry completely, and then we're going to remove our tape. I used a hairdryer to let this dry, but if you have nothing else better to do and you want to watch your paint dry, you can be my guest. Alright, so when you remove your tape, you're going to pull away from your tree. You don't want to just pull down this way, because you're most likely going to tear your paper. This kind of helps it from tearing. So you're just going to go nice and slow and pull off the tape, and then you'll see that it made a nice crisp line. This kind of gives it more of a geometric graphic design kind of look. So there's our other pine tree. I like it. And that's number 3. Okay, the last technique I'm going to show you, which is using a white crayon. And this one's called Wax Resist. I used this one in my first video when I drew fall leaves. It's the exact same thing. So for this one, you might want to draw again just a, ooh, there's something stuck to my pencil. You might want to just draw a really light triangle for our pine tree. And then using our white crayon, we're going to draw a little design. So maybe you want to make this into a Christmas tree if you want to, or you can just add some lines for branches, whatever you want, or even just a swirl. And notice you can't see what I'm doing because I'm just drawing with a white crayon. But you'll see it in a moment. So we're going to use our paintbrush, and we're going to dip it right into the green, and we're just going to paint right over it. And the crayon is going to resist the paint. So when you go over your crayon, see how it's pushing away the paint? That is wax resist. And again, you can use the other green you have, or you can use vertical lines, you can add salt. It is up to you. So I kind of used a combination of both because I wanted to make it kind of blend together. But it's all up to you how you want to paint it. And then again, I'm going to add my little trunk at the bottom. And that is wax resist. To turn your pine trees into Christmas trees, you can use red paint to add ornaments or garland, and a pen to add stars and Christmas presents. Now you have a nice little card. Or you can use these techniques that you learned to create your own pine tree forest. So there you have it. Thanks so much for joining me today. I had fun. I hope you did as well. Be sure to follow me on Instagram at Mrs. Scribbles Art Class and tag me in your artwork if you decide to share. Be sure to subscribe to see more tutorials. Happy scribbling. Bye. I can't do it. I can't do it, Emily.
Yeah, you can. I believe in you.
Thanks, Emily. You can believe in me. Okay.